At the end of fall 2019, I sat with my friends in BD, procrastinating by comparing our Spotify Wrapped data, a feature which Spotify releases that summarizes your past 365 days of music. At first, there were really no surprises for me. My top artist was Beyoncé, my top album was Summer Walker's Over It, and my top new artist was DaBaby. My top 10 albums and songs were overwhelmingly R&B or an R&B rap blend with artists like J. Cole, Miguel, and Bruno Mars, all of which was expected since I would consider R&B my all-time favorite genre. So imagine my surprise when my top genre for the year was not R&B, but something called pop rap. My first thought was, what even is that? So I decided to Google it. Wikipedia defines pop rap as a genre fusing hip-hop's rhythm-based lyricism and pop music's preference for melodious vocals and catchy tunes. Then I decided to Google who are pop rap artists. The results were artists like Drake, Migos, the City Girls, Beyoncé, Alicia Keys, the Black Eyed Peas, The Weeknd, and Tupac, all vastly different artists. I began to realize this pop rap genre didn't have much of a sonological definition. I turned to my friends and jokingly said, so I like R&B and rap, but Spotify just didn't want to say that for some reason. Later, on social media, I noticed that others were expressing confusion over why their top albums and songs were overwhelmingly by R&B or rap artists like Ari Lennox or Lil Baby or SZA or Gunna, but yet their top genre was something called pop rap. I began to wonder, what was Spotify trying to say with this pop rap? Why wouldn't they just say rap or R&B? This bothered me because R&B represents a core part of my identity. When I listen to R&B, I hear myself and my experiences and the history of Black people reflected back at me. So when Spotify told me that my top genre was not R&B, but something called pop rap, that stung a little bit. That sting prompted me to look into how we conceptualize the American popular music narrative. I would like to propose a narrative that more explicitly centers race and racial dynamics in order for us to all more thoughtfully consume media and art. You see, music does not exist in a vacuum outside of society's larger values, structures, or technology. For the purposes of this talk, I'll be focusing on R&B and rock and roll to illustrate what I call the split, or the point in the American music narrative where it hinges on rock and roll in a one-dimensional way and whitewashes American popular music, so that the conversation is split into two, one Black and one white. I'm excited to share this version of the American popular music narrative, which centers Blackness as indispensable to it with you all. Let's start by comparing and contrasting the sonological elements of R&B and rock and roll. First, R&B stands for rhythm and blues. It might best be described as a collection of sounds from the Black Southern musical tradition, like gospel, jazz, and blues. Many early R&B artists got their start and trained their musical ear in the church singing gospel music. The rhythm part of its name is associated with the groove its beat structure produced, and it had an emphasis on the 2 and the 4, or what's known as the backbeat, sort of like a 1, 2, 3, 4 type of emphasis. Its polyrhythmic texture is associated with jazz. The blues part of its name could be associated with its bluesy style sound and its blues style band setup, with piano, guitar, bass, and drums, and sometimes other instruments like strings or horns. R&B's roots in such rich genres make it a highly flexible hybrid genre, capable of an entire wheelhouse of sounds, which is evidenced by its many subgenres and offshoots. Now let's talk about rock and roll. Rock and roll also has roots in the Black Southern musical tradition. Many early rock artists also grew up around the Black gospel sound. As I'm sure many of you are familiar with, rock and roll heavily emphasizes the electric guitar, which is something that jazz and blues popularized. It also emphasizes the backbeat, and it also is cited as using blues band setup with piano, guitar, bass, and drums. It's also quite flexible, and it also has many subgenres and offshoots. At this point, I imagine many of you are wondering, well, what makes them so different? They sound pretty similar. They both have roots in gospel, blues, and jazz. They both emphasize the backbeat, they both have a blues-style band setup, and they're both capable of a pretty heterogeneous sound and have many subgenres and offshoots. What makes them distinct? Well, not much sonically, especially in their early beginnings. In fact, many early Black R&B artists are cited describing that they made the same music their whole career. Just one day, DJs and promoters started calling it rock and roll. And many of rock and roll's earliest innovations were pioneered by Black artists. Let's use Elvis's legacy to explore this. Elvis's status in rock and roll history as the king is centered around his guitar playing, his performance style, and his popular songs. But a lot of his accolades could actually be attributed to other Black artists. His guitar playing could also be attributed to Sister Rosetta Tharpe or Chuck Berry. His performance style, easily attributed to the flamboyant performance style of Little Richard. Even some of his most popular songs were originally recorded by Black artists from smaller labels. Let's take one of his most well-known, Hound Dog. That was originally recorded by a blues artist named Big Mama Thornton. Have you ever heard of her or her original version? Although it did very well on the R&B charts, it never reached the success Elvis's did. This was actually quite common for white artists from bigger labels to re-record songs from Black artists from smaller labels, and yet when they did it, it became rock and roll. To explore this further, let's look at Ruth Brown's story. Have you ever heard of her? Ruth Brown was a talented R&B singer in the early years of rock and roll in the 50s and 60s. In fact, she was so talented that her music kept Atlantic Records alive when it was just a fledgling independent label. So much so that they sometimes called it the house that Ruth built. And yet, when Patti Page covered Ruth Brown's song, What a Dream, it shot to number 10 on the pop charts. And while Ruth Brown's went to number 1 on the R&B charts, it never experienced a pop crossover success. Patti Page enjoyed the splendor of a decades-long career, and Ruth Brown was pushed out of the music industry when Atlantic cut ties with her in the 60s. This was extremely common for Black artists, as white artists were more likely to be signed to bigger labels with more resources who could promote their music, and Black artists were more likely to be signed to smaller labels and were less likely to get booked due to segregation. Although many of rock and roll's biggest acts, including the likes of the Beatles, started their music career recording Black songs, who gets to be remembered as the heroes in rock and roll history? Certainly not these Black artists. So why is it Black artists will get erased or minimized in rock and roll history? Well, to answer that, we actually have to look at another part of genre formation that isn't always highlighted: their social context and construction. You see, genres are not empirical sound categories. They are how we interpret and impart meaning onto these sounds. R&B and rock and roll were no different, yet how do we come to see them so differently? Well, let's talk about the social context they were created in. At its onset, R&B was more of a commercial category. You see, starting in the 20s, the music industry started releasing these phonograph records called race records, which were collections of music from Black artists for Black audiences from Black genres like gospel, blues, and jazz. Then, in the 1940s, the Billboard charts adopted a chart called the Race Records chart, which charted Black popular music. In the 50s, due to changing attitudes towards phrases like race music, they changed the name of the chart to the R&B chart. Since any sound can become popular, at its onset, R&B could sound like anything, but it could not look like anything. It was Black, first and foremost, heavily racializing it. While the rhythm part of its name was associated with the groove it produced in audiences, the blues part of its name kept it firmly rooted in the Black community, since just previously, blues had been race records. Now let's talk about rock and roll. Rock and roll, again, came along in a similar fashion. It was originally a commercial category, because starting in the 50s, radio DJs noticed that white teens were calling in more and more often to hear R&B songs. They decided they needed a new term to describe the same music for their white audiences. Well, what term did they settle on? Rock and roll, to describe the rocking and rolling movement white audiences love so much, with no blues moniker to racialize it as Black. This racialization of genres is not unique. It had happened all before with genres like blues and country and jazz. What makes the racialization of R&B and rock and roll so unique is its intersection with the expansion of mass media, with the popularization of things like radio, television, and movies. You see, rock music and rock artists were peddled through mass media. This reshaped the entire popular music industry, and these changes reflect popular culture as we understand it today, specifically popular music. So then, popular music's association with rock and rock's association with whiteness results in pop music being associated with whiteness, so that pop music becomes white music. And even when pop is no longer rock, pop remains white. This pattern of making Black sounds more palatable to white audiences by using the popular music moniker to put a white face onto a Black sound continued until there was a sound with no white face. Hip-hop is the Black popular sound with no white face. Following the civil rights movement of the 50s and the 60s, and the mainstream success of labels like Motown and artists like Marvin Gaye, Diana Ross, Whitney Houston, and Michael Jackson, Black artists gained more mobility and agency and began charting on mainstream charts like the Billboard Hot 100 as we formally desegregated society. Then, as hip-hop emerges as the next frontier of Black music in the late 80s and 90s, it becomes more and more normal for Black artists to chart on the mainstream charts. This is why in 1991, when the first hip-hop song goes #1, hip-hop becomes the new pop sound. Hip-hop, like R&B, is flexible and diverse and able to be sprinkled across genres. That is why it still reigns today as one of America's top pop sounds and as one of America's top cultural exports. A pop princess or a heartthrob featuring a rapper is a pop hit formula. Pop artists like Ariana Grande can sprinkle in trap drums or rap verses in some of their greatest hits. And Drake, a rapper, has more Billboard hits than the Beatles. And yet I bet many of you would hesitate to call Drake a pop star. And I bet even fewer of you would call rap pop music, even though it proliferates through most of our popular culture today. So what is it about calling Drake a pop star or rap music pop music that feels so blasphemous? It's because hip-hop is the Black sound with no white face. Although post-rock and roll, it became more and more normal for Black artists to chart on the pop charts, the precedent rock and roll set naturalized something which is not natural, the whiteness of pop. The Blackness associated with hip-hop is so potent that it antagonizes the underlying whiteness of pop music. So although the pop rap moniker is contextually and functionally no different than previous genre distinctions, it feels unnatural. This is because hip-hop is the popular Black sound with no white face. And this is due to the R&B and rock and roll split of the 50s and 60s and the unemphasized racial aspects of our American popular music narrative. So here we are today. Rap and R&B can be pop music. At this point, you might be a little confused. Well, why was I so bothered then? Don't I like pop rap? No, I don't. I like rap and R&B music, genres whose sonological elements and social constructions point to how race has impacted and continues to impact American popular music. Music genres are not cut and dry sound categories. Genre might more accurately be thought of as a spectrum of sounds that blend and borrow from each other due to natural human innovation, cross-cultural sharing, or changes in technology. However, it is the social meaning that we ascribe to these sounds or the genres these sounds belong to that creates chasms between rock and roll and R&B, pop and hip-hop, white and Black music. These types of choices situate Black artists and Black music as raw materials available to be harvested by white audiences and white artists and turned into something of value once they're deemed pop music. When combined with barriers from systemic racism, Black music and Black artists are left at a disadvantage, and they are devalued in our history and social awareness. It's not that I don't want Black music to be popular. Of course I do. Black artistry deserves to be loved, and in my unbiased opinion, it's completely enjoyable. But what I don't want, and what Black artistry doesn't deserve, is to have to sacrifice its history to be loved. And that can only happen when its audience is not only cognizant of that history, but protective of it, which is what inspired me to share this talk with you all today, to share knowledge that will help you become a part of this process. Enjoy your favorite music and share your favorite songs and artists. But also remember to share where they came from. Even consider sharing this talk if you're feeling fancy.